Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Navigating Real Estate Turbulence. I'm John Lafferty with Century 21 Town and Country.
I am Tony Abate with Ross Mortgage. Thanks for joining us today. We're gonna talk about some fun stuff because it's just kind of a what's the status of things? What's the pulse of things right now in this market? It seems to change by the minute, but you've gathered some information that we were talking about earlier that it's, things are just different right now in a lot of different categories.
Yeah.
And we thought it'd be a fun episode to just kind of put a cherry on top of all these and talk a little bit about these.
So what we're gonna talk about today and touch on a few things. We're gonna talk about flips. We're gonna talk about Airbnb. We're gonna talk about problem properties, and we're gonna touch on some things that the focus of buyers has shifted in what their priorities are and some things that they're willing to give up. So we're going to talk about each of those. Let's dig into flips. I found this interesting. So the flip market, and by the way, when I say flip, I'm meaning an investor buys a property at a really good price, puts some money into it, improvements into it, and then turns around and sells it for a profit. And that's what we call a flip. And so the flip market is at its lowest point in 20 years, obviously, no doubt due to the high prices that people are getting for homes, and the cost of making the normal improvements to a flip home have gone up, which has cut into their profit. And obviously there's that breaking point of, if I can't make this much profit, then I'm just not going to do it.
Yeah. It's interesting too, on the surface, and I think we both talk to people like this, flips are viewed as easy money. Hey, if I buy that property low and I sell it high, I am in. And if I lather, rinse, repeat, I'm going to make a big pile of money. But the reality is that even in a more balanced market, they don't always come out in the black, do they? So it's not a guarantee for money. Not a guarantee for profit. And you add in the dynamics of this market between sellers calling the shots and the price of materials to do that flip, I can see why it's at its low point.
Yes, and I know people that have done this, and usually it's one screw up. One big screw up where they bought too high, they overvalued what their improvements would be and what they would return on investment would be. They overdid it on that. The models don't work, and they end up losing their shirts, and they're done.
Yeah.
That's it. They're not flipping homes anymore. I saw that happen a lot, especially with the run up in value. You could see these flippers starting to fall away, and right now, unless you're buying in some areas and you're gonna buy and hold, it just doesn't make sense to do this right now. But I just want to dig into this a little bit more. From a lender's perspective, a buyer is purchasing a home that has very obviously been flipped. What do you need? Is there first of all, is there a threshold that a flip triggers red flags and sirens going off? Where they bought it 6 months ago and where they're selling it now. What happens in that regard when you've got to borrow, even on a conventional loan, or are the rules different?
They are. So the strictest environment is for the FHA buyers. There are hard-coded limitations of how long the prior seller has owned the home. And layered in with that run up in price from seller's purchase to the seller's sale to the buyer that we're talking about now. So for instance, if a seller has owned that property for less than 90 days, no FHA financing, it's not going to happen. When it's from 90 days to 6 months, there's a set of requirements that speaks to, do we need a second appraisal if the run up in price has been so much? And in a similar but less egregious way out to 12 months. After 12 months, it doesn't matter. So the answer to the question is for FHA, it's a definite yes, that seller history is important. On conventional, it's really more of a function of the appraisal telling the story. So one of the elements that is in a property appraisal is the sale history of that subject property.
Mm-hmm.
And if there's obvious differences, hey, this seller bought it 12 months ago for $60,000 and he's selling it today for $240,000, the appraiser's got a story to tell. And then the lender can make a decision based on that. In most cases, it's a supportable story. You know, here's the condition of that home before, it was a wreck, and now I did this, and now the market will bear this kind of a price. And it's also a function of lenders needing to be mindful of fraudulent transactions. So
what do you mean by that?
Sure. So if it was bought for that $60,000 and now it's $240,000, how valid can we confirm that the improvements are justified and then it's supported by the current market? Because here's what's happened in the past, and this was the fraudulent part. When there is a quest for fraudulent activity, then everybody involved, with the exception of one or two, is going to be in the know. And that includes the appraiser. So if somebody buys a home at $60,000 and says, well, if all this new stuff was put into this home, I could sell it for $240,000, but I just as soon make that happen without doing all those improvements. And so there's been situations where an appraiser who's in on the fraudulent deal has used substitute photos and doctored the facts to turn in an appraisal to the lender that says it's worth the $240,000. Now, Fannie and Freddie over time have come up with a boatload of tools to help be on the lookout for that through cross-checks. But then who else is involved? Usually the buyer, a straw buyer, as it's often called. They'll write the offer at the $240,000. They're in cahoots with the seller, and the appraiser's going to get a little bit too. And then what happens? Loan funds disperse at the closing table, and the seller splits it with all the parties that contributed to the fraud. So that's why there is maybe a deeper look into when the property has run up in that value, or that difference, you know, what the seller bought it at versus what the seller's buying it at. The lender is going to tap the brakes a little bit and say, let's just be sure. So, and the reason is, you know, going into the recession, we always seem to compare things to what happened going into the recession. There was a great deal of that going on. Lenders were open to have conversations with appraisers. They could handpick different appraisers, and bad things happened. So that's why, you know, there's certainly limiting factors on the FHA transactions, and there's cautionary processes that happen on the conventional deals with regard to here's what it sold for before, here's what I'm selling it for now.
Do you ever see a time in the near future where lenders are going to require homes that are flipped that they show the permits that they pulled to renovate a kitchen, renovate a bathroom? Do you see a time anytime soon where they're going to require that? Because let's be honest, you know, there was a lot of flipping going on in 2009, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. There was a lot of flipping going on. And not always the best workmanship.
Right.
Not always the, things were done to code, as you could see. But buyers were scooping them up because they were such a great deal. And the fear was, at that time, you know, in our circles, what are these homes going to look like 5 years from now? What's going to happen to all this work that was done hurriedly by people who were in the game, these investment flips? So it would seem to me that as a service to buyers and to the banks themselves, that they would want proof that permits were pulled and somebody from the city signed off on it.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think this is Tony talking. You know, I can't speak from a policy standpoint from the company or the industry, of course. I don't think that we're going to see a broad-based requirement for that. And the reason is that the requirements and the guidelines surrounding permits, 31 flavors, depending on the community at hand.
Yeah,
and so, the way a permit is issued in one community could be very, very different than the community for another, or that community might not even require a permit. But here's where it can come into play. So we have that run up in price, like we talked about in the flip, and there's questions as to how supportable all that is. And if it looks dicey, one of the things, I think it comes more into play with what the appraiser is doing on their job. So if something looks questionable, and I mean, it was like let's say it's extreme. They bought it for $30,000 and now they're going to sell it for $250,000. And the appraiser goes to public records, which they're supposed to do anything, and they don't see permits for any of that work, they're probably going to cite that in the appraisal. And that could cause a lender to make a different lending decision because, again, things just aren't adding up. It just doesn't seem copacetic on the way it's coming together. So while I don't see it becoming a requirement per se from a lending guideline, I can see it contributing to the validity of the data and the transaction. We see that kind of thing with square footage differences. You see it in the multi-list, and the multi-list has one square footage, the appraisal has another, and the public records has another. And what do you know? There's a room addition that nobody pulled a permit on, and that's where you get into that discrepancy on the square footage. It happens.
It's extra square footage. I don't want to pay taxes on
heavens
that.
Heavens no. So yeah, you're right. There's almost momentum into not pulling permits, right?
There is, but what's interesting is there's a municipality. When I was selling real estate in California, the municipalities, Los Angeles and Burbank, there was an ordinance in place that allowed the municipalities to claw back taxes from when an improvement was made and not disclosed to the taxing authority, the assessor's office. So if an assessor wasn't aware that a brand new kitchen was put in, they're going to go back and say, okay, when was that kitchen put in? And we want those back taxes.
Yeah, interesting.
So they're doing that. But it's tough, right?
Yeah.
I mean, who do you penalize? Do you penalize the buyer coming in? Do you penalize the person that bought the house and had been there for that number of years? I mean, I don't know.
That's a good point. And especially if this is happening because there weren't permits pulled.
That's right.
How far back do you claw back?
Right.
Who establishes, well, the improvement went in 3.5 years ago?
Which is why I don't think they've done much enforcing with that because it's just really hard to figure. Anyways,
easy to rebut,
and
so I think that the concept is sound, but how do you get some meat on the bone with it? I can see every one of them being challenged.
That's right.
Yeah. So the only winners are the attorneys in that case. Then.
I think you're right. Okay, so Airbnb.
Yeah.
So it was interesting to read that Airbnb has decided that they're going to try and partner with municipalities. The eviction order for landlords to be able to evict tenants who haven't been paying rent, that expires June 30th. So unless it gets extended, landlords will actually be able to start eviction proceedings for tenants who haven't been paying rent regularly. And so Airbnb has said publicly that they want to work with municipalities to find out which landlords have actually evicted tenants, and then they will not work with them on their site to allow them to do short-term rentals, which I thought is interesting. Now, of course, if you're Airbnb, you're at the mercy of every municipality. If they don't tell you, then you'll never know.
Yeah.
So I think it's a gesture of, hey, this is what we'd like to do, but in reality, I don't think it has much teeth at all.
So are they doing that? I guess I'm trying to figure out why Airbnb is taking that position. Is it a goodwill gesture to say, hey, if somebody is being the mean landlord, we're not going to contribute to their machine and let them Airbnb it after they kick out a tenant? Is that where it's going?
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Airbnb has had to kind of work hard to be looked at favorably by municipalities in some cases.
It's true,
right?
And there's currently there is short-term lease legislation in Lansing that is under consideration that's kind of stalled at the moment.
Okay.
And what this legislation would basically do is take short-term rentals out of the commercial use realm. So right now, if you have a landlord-tenant relationship, that's a landlord-tenant relationship.
Okay.
If you have a short-term lease, it's considered commercial.
Okay.
And of course, most HOAs ban the commercial use of property in their development. So where does this apply mainly? Well, this applies on lakes, rivers, where they have associations, and most of them do because they don't want people letting their value of their home go down because it brings down the neighborhood, that kind of stuff. So that's why HOAs were kind of established in the first place, and to prohibit loud noise and partying and all that other stuff. So the idea of the legislation is it'll change that designation of short-term leases to residential use. So now HOAs just can't say you can't. It's a commercial use of property. You can't do that anymore. So it'll allow owners of properties on lakefront and different areas to be able to short-term Airbnb their homes.
Yeah.
Now, we can see the flip side of that, what the issue is, but this legislation says you as a homeowner who lives next door to this still have nuisance laws and things at your disposal and your tools that you can use if somebody's having partier people every weekend come to that house. So anyways, that's in committee right now. It's kind of on pause, but that's the idea, is it gives the power back to the person that owns the property to use that property, as long as it's not breaking any laws, as they see fit.
Interesting. Okay.
So it's it's become sort of a property rights legislation is how they're kind of framing it. So I can see both sides of it.
For sure.
Yeah.
I think Airbnb is probably lobbying on behalf of that legislation pretty aggressively.
Oh, yeah, for sure. For sure.
Yeah.
And in that legislation too, if I understand correctly, there will be a limit on the number of days that you can stay in an Airbnb before it becomes a landlord-tenant relationship.
Okay.
The talk was 30 days, and then there was also talk of making it 27 days or 28 days, so you can only stay 27 consecutive days. Airbnb has their own policy. I don't know what that is, but anyways.
Interesting.
It was an interesting stand that they took.
Yeah.
Problem properties.
Yeah.
This is this was interesting. This NAR did a study and then offered a presentation on ways to improve blight in vacant homes and dilapidated homes that people are still living in. And they had a whole wealth of solutions and suggestions to help the poorer neighborhoods. Because let's be honest, if you're a senior citizen and you've lived in this home for 30, 40, 50 years, and this is all you have, well, as a senior, there's people on fixed income. They don't have a lot of money, so when the roof starts to leak, they don't have the money to fix it, the equity to fix it. So things start getting dilapidated. It starts leading to further problems, and pretty soon the home is uninhabitable. And then there are less than people who buy homes and with the idea of renting them out, or with the idea of just buying and holding, and just let the home go to crap and let it dilapidate and everything else. And of course, in bad neighborhoods, or not bad neighborhoods, but in certain areas, those things become drug houses, transient houses, houses for people to do illicit and illegal things in, and not good for a neighborhood.
Right. Yeah. And that's been the problem was exaggerated when in the city of Detroit they had a great deal of vacant properties, and investors were buying them sight unseen. They were paying so little, they didn't really care. They didn't, hey, I don't care if I get repossessed. If I have an opportunity to sell it, make some money, I'm going to do that. But if I don't, then I have no incentive to pay the taxes. I have no incentive to mow the lawn. So good for NAR for stepping in and trying to find some solutions, because everybody loses when those kind of negative things happen.
Agreed. And the city of Warren has been viewed at times to have a heavy hand in how they do some of these things, how how they inspect properties and slap a certificate of occupancy or a tag on a property. I'll tell you that they're pretty vigilant. If they find out a property's vacant or vacated, if they get wind of it, they're pretty aggressive in slapping a tag on it that says you must have the city come in and inspect this property before anybody can occupy it. And it's their way of, kind of a couple things, making sure that the house is habitable and that it's up to code with current things. They're really striving to fight, it's an old term, cliche term, but the slumlords.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and I'm not one to advocate an overly heavy hand from the government, but to me, this really seems like everybody wins when that kind of thing happens, because you've got the property owner who's across the street from one of those blighted properties, and that property owner is doing everything right. He's maintaining his home, he's cutting the grass, he's keeping it in good shape, but his value is severely negatively impacted by the properties that are nearby that are neglected. And that's not fair.
That's you're getting at the crux of it right there, and that was their conclusion: is if you help maintain those other properties or have minimum standards for those other properties, well, it not only helps those properties, it helps the neighbors. And what happens to the values? Well, they go up, and that increases the tax base for the school system in the communities that they're in. So it's a win-win for everybody in the end, and that's their conclusion. Yeah,
it's creating conditions and incentives for more of the homeowners to be like that guy who's maintaining his home properly, and then everything happens positively when that happens, like you described.
Yeah. Agreed. And our last topic, just talking about things that buyers are really looking for in the market. And the pandemic has had an effect on really what is important for a buyer when they're considering where they want to live. And steaming right to the top and never being on this list before is a quiet location.
Interesting.
Because people are working from home. They don't want to hear all the noises when they're on the Zoom call with work or on the phone with somebody overseas. They want to be able to have that quiet Zoom call, that quiet phone conversation.
Yeah, that's an interesting one too. And I've worked with buyers that are selling their home, and you've probably seen this more than I have. But in side chatter with what's going on with them, they'll say, you know what, we're both working from home indefinitely. Which even as restrictions are on the cusp of being lifted, there's a lot of companies that are saying, we don't have a date. You're going to be working from home for as long as we can see. Not all of them, but many of them. And I've talked to folks that are selling their home because their conclusion is, we're both working from home, but we can only really accommodate one good home office, and the other spouse is working in the kitchen or working. It's like this, we're going to kill each other. This has to be fixed.
Yeah.
So it has changed things for sure.
It definitely has. Another one on that list is a large backyard.
Okay.
Now that's kind of been a consideration before, but it's jumped up the list. There's more people taking it into consideration.
Yeah.
And I think obviously part of it has to do with pets. A lot of people adopted dogs during the pandemic, and so they want a bigger backyard for their pet to run around in or to go hang out in. Because when you're in the house, inside working all day, I mean, what's the first thing you want to do? You want to go hang out outside just to breathe some fresh air and just hang out and just. So having a larger yard gives you some separation between you and the neighbors, right?
I can see that. Yep.
Another thing that jumped on the list that was never on before, it was always a consideration when I've talked to most buyers. Very few, unless they had, it's a garage. It's a major consideration, and usually with a lot of first-time buyers, it was, a garage would be nice, but I don't have to have a garage. Only those that typically were like working on cars and doing different things that a garage was uber important, but it's up near the top of the list of importance.
Interesting. Yeah. So anything kind of passé now? Anything fallen off the list that was a hot item before?
Yeah, at the top of that list, having a pool.
Okay. Yeah.
Don't really care anymore.
Yeah.
Some do. Some put it as in importance, but it's fallen by a big number, by almost 25%. Is they're willing to buy without, and that's a big deal. Another one, sort of high on the list, is man caves, so to speak.
They're not desirable anymore, according to.
Well, they're willing to buy a house that doesn't have it,
Interesting.
or even the possibility of having one.
Okay.
I mean, you go back the last 5-6 years, man caves were always, the term for man cave.
Right.
But it was, hey, I've got this place in the basement that I can go do my thing, hang out, have the boys over, watch some sports. We're not, we're not taking over the whole house. We're just in the basement in our man cave doing our thing, and that's one of the things that, hey, not so important.
Interesting.
Willing to, great if it has it, doesn't have it, okay with that too.
Yeah. Wow, that came and went before I even had a man cave. So never had. I guess my chances passed now. So.
Yeah. Well, yeah, me too. But that's just some of the things that were interesting and that are more consideration now, a little less now, and just how it's changed a little bit in priorities. And that kind of squares with people who are, let's say, who've lived in Royal Oak or Berkeley or Ferndale and have been there for, a number of years, and for whatever reason need a bigger house because maybe their family's growing, or have decided this house isn't big enough because one of us is going to work from home, or both of us are going to work from home. We need more space. And if we're going to get more space, then why don't we get a bigger piece of property with that space, with more areas where you can work, I can work. And where are you going to find that's affordable? You got to go north.
Got to go out. Yeah.
Got to go out and away. And people are willing to do that because if you don't have to drive to work, then living in Grand Blanc, living in Genesee County, living in Saginaw County, or even further north or going up north, it all starts to make sense.
And I can see that too. If you're in tight quarters, and you use the example like the Royal Oaks and the Berkeleys, those kind of communities, if you're gone for 10 hours of the day and then you come home to that closeness may not be such a negative. But if that's your whole day, I can see the feeling where, the walls and neighboring houses are kind of closing in on me. I need a little breathing room. Interesting.
That's a very astute observation. Very true. I'm sure that's what a lot of people experience, or the neighbors are working from home, you're working from home, you're upstairs having a conversation, you can hear them having their conversation in between the houses. It's plain as day. Yeah, you feel like you never get a break, you never have privacy.
Yeah. Interesting. Boy, you got to stay on top of that so that when you're talking to sellers and they bring up, hey, wait till you see my cool man cave, you got to be the one that says, you know what, the takers may not be as robust as they once were. Things have changed. So cool stuff.
Yeah. Well, it was fun to look into these.
And
talk about them.
Yeah.
So with that, hey, thank you for listening. We appreciate it, and we like to do these market updates about twice a year. Have a little fun with it, just kind of see what the landscape is looking at out there. So hopefully you found this useful today. And if you're interested in more information, reach out to Tony or myself. We'd be happy to talk to you.
Yeah, and I forget to plug, don't forget to subscribe to us on YouTube and follow us on Facebook. Those are the biggies for us right now, right? And our website, Navigating Real Estate Turbulence.
And of course, you can find our podcasts, just our audio version of these, on Apple Podcasts, Apple, Google, and Spotify, I believe.
Right. We always miss that stuff.
We do.
So thanks, everybody.
Thanks.